Hello everybody and welcome back to another amazing video that we are going to react to. We are going to see the royal edge, why monarchs are more responsible with power, from Lavader, which, some announcements. I went to the orthodontist, and I don't know if you can see, but to help my overbite, I'm going to sound really stupid. Just a bit. But the other thing too, for announcements is I've had a change. I've been watching a bit of some other kinds of people like John Doyle, and I think a lot of my opinions have changed a bit. And I feel like I've been much closer with Lavader. I feel like I really do believe in a lot of the stuff he's saying now. I really do think he has a lot of great points, a little bit more than last time. I agree with him more. That's the point. I'm starting to agree with him a little more on things, especially like corporatism, which I disagreed a lot more back then. But anyways, I just want to react.
Comes to your When you hear the word power, what is the first thing that comes to your mind? Power will be viewed differently depending on who you ask. Some people will see it with disgust, some will see it as a necessary evil, and others may see it positively as a structure that binds society together.
Back then, well, just like, I don't know, a month ago or something, my main idea was all power, whether, like, what is used, it's usually really bad, or at least, like, 80% of the time, it's trash. It's evil, it should never be used. But over time I realized that our enemies, the people who want to destroy our culture and our national identity, they're not going to play by that rule. They're going to use all the power they can, which means we have to use it back. But we got to use it responsibly. We got to use it in a responsible and well-mannered way. And that's why, well, yeah, it says you gotta be more responsible with power. I think power, it's not inherently evil. Obviously, since men are inherently evil, or to a certain extent, like no one is perfect. No human is perfect. That's what God said. And like, just because of that, we can't just, that doesn't mean that we can create a well-balanced way between, like, the monarch and many others, like, and create that blend and power within certain people. I think some people are much better, and I am very optimistic about some people. That's kind of how I feel now, honestly.
As for me, well, frankly, I see power as something that can be very positive for a society. The question only is, who is the person who wields this power and how responsible is he or she with it?
Yeah, because it depends who's using that power. If the left is using that power, hey, no, get rid of that, destroy it. Or better yet, we can wield it back. We could get the power back to us, and we could be able to wield and use it for good. I think this works way better. We can change the culture. We can change, how everyone kind of has been acting. We can kind of bring back those conservative values, especially with, like, the monarch, because the monarch, they're going to try and be neutral. They're going to try and be to the people. They're not biased. And it's kind of like the Supreme Court. I mean, like, just because the Supreme Court is there forever, right? That doesn't make them wrong. That doesn't make them corrupted. Not all people voted in are, not all people voted in are good. Some people who are, inherit it or are given this by someone else and not voted in within some kind of time frame, it can be really good. Obviously, we had really bad stuff like Roe v. Wade, but it got changed. It got overturned by good people in the Supreme Court. And I think something like the Supreme Court monarch something that can totally rule.
As a monarchist, I put my trust in the king or queen to do this task effectively. But there is this phenomenon that I have commonly seen. People absolutely terrified of the idea of a monarch wielding significant power over the nation, and how it will inevitably lead to tyranny and the suppression of people's rights. This line of thinking is due to the famous liberal theory of power. As the saying goes,
Liberalism.
power corrupts. So someone who already wields significant power, over time will start to abuse it more and more to benefit themselves and their inner circle, thus over time becoming even more corrupt. And the liberal solution to this issue is putting quote-unquote handicaps on those in power, either through a constitution or parliament, to make sure that no one will be able to abuse power for their own advantage. And then the images of dictators that pop into our heads, like Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Mao Zedong. They just further cement this idea that so much power in the hands of a single person.
Do you know what they all have in common? Secular, secular, secular. They were all atheists. What does that tell you, though? Like, when you look at monarchs, most of them are religious, or are very, like, they do try and get closer to God. What that tells me is that I think a lot of it goes to just, are you religious? That doesn't mean if you're atheist, or, or, like, not religious, that doesn't mean you're evil or horrible person. In fact, you could be a little bit moral. However, I think when you're religious, you're way more moral. You are much, much better, because there is a route of what your morals are and what those are. Because if morality is subjective, then what makes them wrong? Tell me. If morality is subjective, then what makes their decision making wrong?
Can cause so much harm, which is why no man should be allowed to wield so much of it as to prevent
I'm real
tyranny
sorry.
and potentially
I can't control
save the lives of millions. I have been researching and reading about the theory of power for quite some time now, and the further I went down this rabbit hole, the more I realized something that as a monarchist I already had a feeling about but could not adequately explain it. And that is that monarchs are so much more responsible with wielding power than any other kind of leader. So in this video, I want to present my arguments on this matter, challenging this prominent liberal theory of power corrupting and giving my best to properly explain why in almost every scenario
I give credit to God.
a monarch would be the most responsible with wielding power and influence.
The theory of power.
For many years, social psychologists firmly believed that power leads to corruption. But as time went on and research started evolving more profoundly, several
By the way, I think this guy represents something. Look at that. It's like he's on an iPad, almost. A tablet. Right? I think, this kind of represents something. How we're stuck. We're stuck on something. We're stuck on that screen. It's especially Gen Alpha. I mean, I know it's not an iPad, but, like, I would like to make that comparison to add another point. How we're all been corrupted and addicted to screens and devices that, like, yeah, there's some advantages. You could watch a Lavader video or, one of my videos, but you can also be shown sexual content, inappropriate content, especially, porn. And what that tells me is that sometimes you need some strong authority to help you, right? Not all the time. Not like, I feel like it's non-binary. It's non-binary of like just government good or government bad. I think the government can be, placed in some good ideas and like, implement in some actions. However, I do want to be always skeptical of government. That doesn't mean I want to get rid of it. I just want some level limits, and I think monarchs inherently have a limit when they put God above them, right? And that's why I would trust them way more above dictators, because dictators, they put themselves above God. They're trying to put themselves above the Lord, if you know what I mean. Like, and yeah, let's just make a more atheist argument, I guess, or like secular. It monarchs still try and limit themselves most of the time. Like, they care more about the people. Dictators don't really. Like, they don't really have a reason to care for the people.
Doubts have been cast down on this widely believed thought. The truth, in my personal opinion, is that power does not necessarily corrupt, nor is it necessarily a magnet to those corruptible, but rather, power reveals and amplifies traits that already exist within a person. I will be basing this part mainly off of an article titled The Psychology of Political Power by Parul Verma. I will be leaving a...
And remember, humans, we're inherently influenced by Satan. You can have someone though who's like, close to God and nearly perfect in every way. He's still gonna make mistakes, but he's still trying. But then you have really evil and degenerate people, right? And obviously you get probably the worst of the worst, like, rapists and pedophiles, right? It's a spectrum of people most of the time on, like, the morality. You'll have good people, you'll have bad people.
A link to it down in the description among the sources, so I also highly recommend you to check it out. Probably the best quote-unquote evidence that power inevitably leads to corruption we have is the famous Stanford prison experiment, which I assume many of you have at least heard about it. The experiment went something like this. It involved volunteer college students who were randomly assigned to be either prisoners or guards. A mock prison was set up in the basement of the Stanford Psychology building, and the participants were asked to act out their roles as prisoners and guards. The aim of the experiment was to see how people would act when given a position of power. Would they be generous, kind, or cruel? The experiment was supposed to last 2 weeks, but it was terminated after only 6 days. The study quickly spiraled out of control, with the guards becoming abusive and the prisoners showing signs of extreme stress and emotional distress. So what was the conclusion? Power corrupts. And so the experiment was taken as a success and showed how power corrupts people. Or does it? In 2007, around 40 years after the Stanford prison experiment was conducted, Thomas Carnahan and Sam McFarland wanted to answer a question. Could participant self-selection have led to the cruelty? They were interested in researching the types of individuals who are attracted to and take part in experiments like the Stanford prison experiment. So, students were recruited in the exact same way as the students 40 years ago, with a virtually identical newspaper ad, and this is what the two uncovered. Quote, volunteers for the prison study scored significantly higher on measures of the abuse-related dispositions of aggressiveness, authoritarianism, Machiavellianism, narcissism, and social dominance, and lower on empathy and altruism, two qualities inversely related to aggressive abuse. Carnahan and McFarland, with their experiment, revealed something that was not thought about for 40 years after the first experiment. That gaining and wielding power did not suddenly make those students cruel, but these students already possess these traits, and by giving them a position of power, it amplified them and pretty much quote-unquote exposed them for all to see. And these people who have these traits are attracted towards obtaining power in order to satisfy their domineering and sadistic traits. There are also other general issues with the original experiment that make it very unreliable. A Medium article about the experiment also reveals that the original pioneers of it may have edged the students to be cruel towards the prisoners. So overall, today the Stanford prison experiment is not seen as reliable. Power itself does not corrupt. It is very much possible that it attracts those who are easily corruptible, but most importantly, it just strengthens and exposes the inherent traits you already possess. Many people like to take the Roman Emperor Caligula as an example of tyranny and how it completely ruins a country. But shortly after Caligula came to power, Rome started developing and he lived up to the expectations of his people. He eliminated many taxes and created massive employment opportunities for Roman citizens. Overall, in the beginning, Caligula was well liked, and he was a breath of fresh air after the tyranny of Tiberius. But then Caligula started suffering from a disease that had a massive impact on his brain and mentality, leading the emperor down towards a path of corruption and abusing his power. But again, power itself did not corrupt him.
I think, like I said already, how humans are not inherently good. I don't think every human's evil, obviously. But also, you can be corrupted on your own. It's not really the power that can corrupt you. Sometimes it could be Satan. You have more of an opportunity to be corrupt. That's what I suspect, because you could be like, I don't know, really poor, you live in the streets, right? And you can't really control the country, right? But you know for sure that person is going to be way worse and way more evil if they had that opportunity, if they were corrupted and bad in the heart. Meanwhile, yeah, people with power, right? And not all of them are going to be bad. Right? Like, what's wrong with a little bit of power, right? Like, or even just using power for good use and good purposes. We live in this idea that, like, we have to be like Reagan all the time, where it's always government have to be small every single time. Always small government, no more big government. But helping out the community, right? Sometimes you need to have a bit of power, and sometimes you need to have a strong arm to come in and smash something or just change something. And maybe the point is not to destroy. Maybe we have to create something, right? I think wielding power for a non-corrupted use, for the community, for family, for tradition, I think that's what really matters more.
If it did, then Rome would have never experienced the many benefits at the
Just because you
beginning
have
of his
power,
reign.
that doesn't make you evil.
When you think of a dictatorship, autocracy, or really any system in which a person has a significant amount of power, you will think of things like a massive police state, no freedom of speech, and overall, mass persecutions and terrors against those who do not align with the views of the state. And when we bring up people like Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, and so forth, these are all things that were present during their rules. Alongside what I would call populist or authoritarian regimes, in the 19th and 20th century, there were also other kinds of authoritarian regimes, those being monarchies and royal dictatorships. And if one studies both centuries, one would notice a very big difference between the two. While both kinds are authoritarian, sometimes autocratic, there is a significant difference in how those at the top wielded and used this power. Let me give some examples.
Also, populist dictatorship, I don't know if Stalin came with the definition of populism, or someone like Hitler. What they did all have in common is that they were all socialist and communist. I think that does link in with inherently bad stuff that's going to happen. Because communism inherently, I don't think can work. Socialism is corrupted with the start, right? That's what I think is a bad use of power, right? To kind of force and steal and kind of try and distribute equally and all that. A tiny bit of socialism, right? Like, I think it could make sense, right? But using a lot of it, right? Going too far with it, I think is the problem. FDR was a good example where he started out with some decent programs, but then he went too far. He pushed it all the way. Even his vice president was angry at him for what he did. And FDR ran elections multiple times. He pushed the welfare state so far that actually it hurt the economy. And it took America a longer time to recover than most other countries, right? And it's just funny to me. They still think socialism can work and communism can work, but it won't work.
Probably the best example in this video I can give is Kaiser Wilhelm II. While the German Empire had elections, it was far more authoritarian than other monarchies like the United
But
Kingdom.
Wilhelm did it right. He tried to avoid war. He was very peaceful, and he was, when forced to, and push comes to shove, he actually did try to fight back, and he tried to be as well prepared as possible. Unfortunately, he lost.
Under the German constitution, the Kaiser had the full power to dissolve the parliament at any given moment.
He
Was
did.
the only one who could appoint the chancellor and fire him at will, and the Kaiser commanded the entire land force, being able to appoint naval and army officers and ordering reforms. Overall, much more authoritarian. If we consider the liberal theory that power corrupts, the German Empire would have become much more authoritarian over time, with Wilhelm II abusing his immense privilege to assert his power and dominance over the country. And yet, none of that happened. Despite his immense political privilege, he never really abused them. In fact, the vast majority of the time he played along with Parliament.
The other thing too, the Weimar Republic, one of their biggest policies that I think really does interest me is they had a huge limit on gun rights, and took away the ability to own firearms. Later on, Hitler took over, and that's kind of what happened there, where he pushed it as far as possible. I believe he only gave guns to evil people that would shoot the Jews and stuff, and encouraged many Germans to do that. But back then, in the German Empire, it wasn't as much of a worry. You could actually, I don't know, I don't know really for sure, but I think you could use a firearm. You could carry it around, because Europe wasn't as liberal at the time. I still think all the other countries banned guns, though. They all had that banning of guns, but the German Empire, I don't know if they banned their guns. They might have, but I don't know. If they didn't, which I think they didn't, because the Weimar Republic made a bunch of laws about it, then that kind of shows that they're being light and kind of giving that power to people who can't really defend themselves. If you commit a crime, you have a gun and stuff, but someone else has a weapon to defend themselves, you don't really need to rely on the police or the government, right? You can kind of have that strength for yourself, right? And which I truly think is a better idea. I don't think we should rely on the police, right? Because they're going to take 30 minutes. We got to rely on God only. And, I don't know what you'll say about, guns too much, right? My family is kind of just we don't carry firearms, which I won't carry firearm, but I think people should carry firearms for defense if they truly feel like they're in danger. And I don't really believe that it's an immoral thing. I think it's a good thing, honestly. If you have a firearm, hunting also is pretty cool. But most of the time, it's used in case government becomes corrupt, or there is criminals and the people committing crimes, and there's someone giving you an actual threat.
Giving hour-long lectures trying to convince the parliament to pass his bills, when he could have, dissolved them and proclaimed a royal dictatorship. He had the full right to do so. Another example is the SPD party, the Social Democrats. It's no secret that Wilhelm absolutely despised the Social Democrats and everything they stood for, and he was not afraid to hide it either. In a speech in 1889, he would state, quote, "I regard every Social Democrat as an enemy of the empire and the fatherland." And despite his immense disdain for the SPD, he never resolved to drastic measures to weaken their political power. In fact, since 1890, in every single election, the Social Democrats became stronger and stronger, and after the 1920 election concluded, the SPD became the strongest party in the entire country, holding the most seats in parliament. Wilhelm was obviously not happy with these results, and he reacted with considerable frustration. And yet, he accepted it and resolved to at least try working with them. Even after they gained power, a party he openly labeled as the enemies of the empire, Wilhelm never took to drastic measures to abuse his royal powers to curb their influence. The Russian Empire is probably one of the most famous examples of absolute monarchism, with the Tsars holding absolute and autocratic power over Russia for hundreds of years. And in the late 19th century,
And you might say, oh, but it was really crappy and horrible to live in, the conditions are all bad, but when you're dealing with such a large and fast-growing, rapid rate population, it's kind of like Mexico, where, yeah, I mean, like, maybe a bad example, because they're actually being corrupt. Meanwhile, the Tsar was not really corrupt. The Tsar couldn't really, change Russia to becoming some, from this area where everything is super cold, and you don't really have the best environment, and you have a super growing fast population, and you have all this stuff happening, right? You can't just, oh, everything's perfect. They did put massive infrastructure, industrialize the nation, and do the best they can. They pushed the most they could, right? And the biggest thing they did was protect the family unit. They protected, the great values of Russia. They protected their culture. They were protecting religion. And look what happens now. Russia's now extremely religious, massive growing population, fast, insanely fast. But who killed it? The communists. And the communists were way worse than the Russian Empire, in my opinion.
Russia established a secret police called the Okhrana to deal with political opponents. When you think of a secret police, you may think of organizations like the Gestapo or the NKVD, both ruthless organizations that brutally suppressed and rooted out any kind of opposition. And the Okhrana is primarily seen the same way, a brutal Tsarist branch that suppressed anyone who was against the monarchy. But if you actually look into the Okhrana, you will realize just how lenient they were. By 1900, the Okhrana only employed around 8,500 agents in an
Do you know how many people are employed in the government? We have over 3 million. And that's not even counting, everybody. Just anyone who has some level of a connection to the government at all might be around 30 million, 20, 25 million, maybe even pushing 30. What does that tell you? Yeah.
Empire with over 150 million people. And if we calculate
That's
that,
massive,
that is
man.
around 17,000 people per one agent. In comparison, the NKVD, at its absolute height in 1930, had hundreds of thousands of agents. Even the claims of Russian police and agent brutality are exaggerated. Despite having this reputation of a brutal autocracy, only the absolute worst offenders, such as convicted or confessed political assassins, were given the death penalty, a more common punishment for political
Which
offenders.
They also, took out really evil people like pedophiles, which California refuses to arrest because, we don't want to hurt their feelings or some crap. Russia was like, they actually took out the evil people of their country. And we can't do that. What does that tell you? What does that tell? The fact that the Russian Empire is actually becoming more they're being more responsible than our, liberal, free world. It's crazy, man. It's crazy. If I were to pick which country actually would be, better for children, actually safe, the Russian Empire would say maybe more safe from, really dangerous groups like pedophiles or, just really, really evil people. I would actually say they actually could protect it better than California because they're just gonna... Nothing happens. Nothing happens. They're free. They're let go. There was 1,000 pedophiles that got released back in 2020 and 2021 or something.
was penal labor, and yet even this was rarely handed down unless the crime was heinous. In the period between 1825 until 1917, the supposedly fearsome and tyrannical Tsarist regime executed only 6,321 people for all crimes
Like
combined,
the
which is
what they say about the Spanish Inquisition, where it only killed like maybe at the most 30,000. That's pushing it. I think it's more like 10,000 over a 500 year period. And remember, like the this is still like very very large population and density there at the time for Spain. It was like Spain had like 20 million people. I don't know, something like it was kind of big, right? It was like between 5 and 10 million. So maybe it wasn't a lot compared to the other European countries, but it was still kind of big, right?
absolutely
Which
insane.
and the French the French Revolution, they killed like 40,000 in like a few years.
Especially when you keep in mind that since the assassination of Alexander II, Russia was anything but a politically stable state. And then we have a few other smaller examples like Romania under Carol II and Yugoslavia under Alexander I. Both of these European countries became royal dictatorships in the interwar period. But they didn't become dictatorships because the monarchs suddenly woke up one day and decided to take absolute power, but rather they all came after a significant political crisis, and the royals used their royal prerogatives in order to stabilize and bring order to their states and solve the crisis. And even after the royal dictatorships were established, Yugoslavia and Romania were both still pretty normal countries, with several civil liberties still guaranteed. To be fair, political opposition was suppressed, but instead of resorting to mass terror campaigns and pogroms against the general populace like in usual dictatorships, they mainly targeted high-ranking individuals with significant influence that could be a threat, or going after very specific political groups like fascists and communists. But I believe you get the point already. If we compare populist regimes with royal ones on issues like civil liberties, secret police, political opposition, and so on, we will see that the royal ones are much more milder and lenient on these issues compared to the populist ones, with the latter being much more ruthless and uncompromising on these issues. There is a very clear divide on how power is used and executed in these regimes. Why are monarchies so much more milder and lenient compared to other types of regimes that either have a populist or military dictatorship? And why do monarchs, despite having and holding so much power, act so much more responsibly with their royal prerogatives? It all starts making sense once we consider the previous conclusion we got on power and corruption. Power reveals and amplifies traits that already exist within a person. This would definitely explain it. When we also think about the fact that a monarch and the average person who becomes a dictator are going to have extremely different upbringings, and thus different outlooks on how power works. Typically born into royalty, monarchs are raised with a strong sense of duty and responsibility towards their nation and subjects.
And usually, I think this is actually one of the biggest points too. They have a father. Look at Hitler. He had a horrible father. If you have a horrible father figure, you're gonna have a you're gonna become like Hitler probably. Okay, maybe not Hitler, but you would probably be not so good. You'll have a lot of problems. It's a lot better to have a father figure in the household. And look at Stalin. Horrible father too, who beat him, made him bleed like when he pissed, right? And who else? Like Mao Zedong, you think he had a great relationship with his father? No. These people, these dictators that ruled over, had horrible fathers. All they thought about was you gotta have abuse and power, and like when you have power, you abuse it as much as possible because they were abused. And, just because they were abused, right? Like, yeah, I'm not saying, if you're abused, you're always gonna, that's the only thing that creates that type of thinking. That stuff can, you can have a decent life and still be like that, because again, Satan, right? Satan does that to everyone. But usually, if you have an abusive father or just a bad relationship, or even if you're fatherless, right? You're gonna grow up with a tougher sense of morality. And usually, right, like the father's there to teach his children, to make them better, right? That's kind of how it went.
Their education emphasizes history, governance, and diplomacy,
Bro,
fostering a
I love
long-term
learning all
vision
that.
for
I
their
want to be a
realm.
monarch.
This upbringing instills in them a sense of stewardship and a duty to uphold traditions and maintain stability, influencing a more cautious and legacy-oriented use of power. It is exactly because monarchs are born into a position of power that they are not that likely to turn to corruption. They already have a vast fortune, and their position of power is already secure from the moment they are born. So, if they are already secured with money and power, then what kind of reason would they have to turn to corruption in the first place? The main reason why people turn to corruption in the first place is due to those two reasons. For that reason, the overwhelming majority of scandals royals find themselves in are love or affair scandals, not necessarily corruption scandals. With this, I would also like to use the book On Power, The Natural History of Its Growth by the author Bertrand Juvenel. This is an excellent book that I recommend all of you to check out if you want to learn more about power and how it manifests. In regards to monarchs, Juvenel would write, quote, "The monarch is not in the least a creature of his people set up to satisfy their wants. He is rather a parasitic and dominating growth which has detached itself from the dominating group of parasitic conquerors. But the need to establish his authority, to maintain it and keep it supplied binds him to a course of conduct which profits the vast majority of his subjects. To suppose that majority rule functions only in democracy is a fantastic illusion. The king, who is but one solitary individual, stands far more in need of the general support of society than any other form of government. And since it is human nature for habit to engender affection, the king, though acting at first only from concern for authority, comes to act with affection as well, and in the end to be motivated by affection." Juvenel describes the monarch not as a leader created to satisfy the people's needs, but as an initially dominating figure, possibly detached from the common interests of the populace. However, he notes that the monarch's need to maintain authority and ensure its continual support, quote, "binds him to a course of conduct which profits the vast majority of his subjects." This suggests that, even if initially self-serving or detached from the populace, the monarch is compelled to act in ways that are beneficial to the majority. This shift in conduct is not necessarily altruistic, but is driven by practicality and the need for stability.
And imagine, it's kind of like he's also married to the country, right? The monarch is married to the country. They are binded. They can't just leave, right? If a monarch is with them, they have to have that responsibility, or the marriage fails, which means the country fails, right? That's why I truly think it goes based off, right? And yeah, I agree with Lavader here. You know what I mean? I truly do think monarchs, they inherently have more of that responsibility, but also they see the risk. The risk. They know they can't just fail. They know they can't fail it. Because if they fail everyone. Their country falls apart, and even if they want power and they love it and the money, they lose it all if they know they fail. Dictators don't really see it the same way. Most of the time they have a very secular kind of thinking, a very materialistic type of thinking, right? And they won't really see the future as much. Now, obviously, there's some really smart dictators, right? But, you know, most of the time, I don't think they really see the future ahead of them. They kind of are just trying to do what's like right now. they're very impatient, and a lot of them are, it's not the fact that they're corrupt, it's the fact that they are just filled with hatred and evil in their hearts. And again, I apologize with the lisp. Playing the orthodontist, man. I hate this.
Would conclude by saying that this necessity for support and authority leads to a change in behavior and ultimately a change in motivation, from self-interest to affectionate concern for the well-being of the subjects. And this naturally makes a lot of sense. Monarchs are driven to think in the long term. One day they're gonna pass their country down to their heir. And since the monarch is the state, and the state is their property, then the question arises. What kind of incentive would a monarch have to basically destroy their own property? Populist leaders, on the other hand, are gonna have an entirely different upbringing and experience with life, which will shape their views on power. Populist leaders often emerge from outside traditional elites. Their rise is frequently tied to charisma and the ability to resonate with public sentiment, particularly dissatisfaction. They often see power as a means to implement significant changes rapidly, driven by a mandate from their supporters. This can result in a more aggressive and transformative approach to power. A populist approach to power can be more direct, forceful, and transformative.
I don't think that means they're going to be inherently evil, right? It's the problem is that the dictator, they're going to be filled with hatred. I think populism and dictatorship don't really align well, because like most people will become dictators out of fear and wanting like that security. It's different with a monarch because they're already kind of given to it, and they kind of like they worry about the long term and try to make themselves better. It's kind of like imagine a business, right? You kind of already have the business running, and you want to keep it running forever because you like to pass it on to your next, to your kin, to your family and like children stuff. So you try to keep the company rolling. Meanwhile, if you're kind of like trying to get that charisma edge, get to the power, get to the top, you're going for the all the stuff, right? Especially also with like things like democracy, and right, which we're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic. We have a limit on ourselves. Democracy is just meaning like, I don't know, the majority picking whatever. Those groups, they're gonna try and accumulate the stuff, right, from the business, because they're not the CEO. They're kind of just someone who's there. Dictators, once they hit that edge, they hit all that power, they're gonna try and secure out of fear, right? Monarchs already kind of they'll try and secure their power, but it's not the same way. It's a very different experience, and all the time, right, they're connected with God more, right? They're afraid of the Lord, so they do good. Which I know I'm talking a lot about religion, Christianity, but I think it's a very key factor. I mean, like, why do you think most of the really successful monarchs, they're all Christian monarchs, right? Wilhelm, right? Like, there's not that many monarchs that were like, willing to share power, or, genuinely did some good decision making. You don't really see it in countries outside of the West, right? Most of them are kind of very heavy towards the dictatorship, even if they are monarch, right? And as for this like populism, right? I think populism can be a good thing, right? You just gotta use the power correctly. Like Trump, I think, used a lot of his power correctly. I kind of like the dude. I think he did some good stuff for the country, right? Mussolini, he did it wrong. Like, he literally brainwashed the youth against power, which is something that another group does.
Because of the fact that their mandate comes from a mobilized public rather than a traditional or institutional legitimacy.
Yep, tradition.
This is why these kinds of dictators are a lot more.
You gotta have that tradition, family,
in order to achieve
and
a certain goal, no
push to try and protect your culture.
But that is not all. These kinds of leaders almost certainly went through the ranks.
Think of the citizens as your family, right? I think that's how a lot of monarchs see it.
To get to the position they are in now. meaning they had to compete against other opponents and enemies in order to wiggle their way to power. And as I sometimes
Wiggle
like
their
to say,
way.
the path towards obtaining power will always be riddled with blood, betrayals, and corruption. And this process is inevitably going to change and shift a
That is
person's
true.
view on power and how to use it. A process monarchs don't really have to go through because they are already born into that position. But it is also tied to the perspective both kinds of leaders hold when exercising power. A populist dictator will always look through the lens of their political ideology or party. If you are a communist, you believe that the state is communist and cannot be anything else. And for that reason, you will try to rapidly transform your country into a communist state, alongside brutally suppressing and wiping out any kind of opposition from other political parties and ideas.
And
Anything that
you're
does not
going to be
belong to my
atheist most
political
likely,
ideology is bad and
because
should be
communism
driven
is a
out.
religion.
Monarchs, on the other hand, are not raised to pledge their allegiance to a party or political ideology, but rather just the country. They don't act and rule
And they care about the country and its values. That's the key point. They care for the country, right? They see it as like a marriage, like I said.
based on a specific ideology.
If I were a monarch, I
but
would
rather
see
what they think
my
is the
country
best for
as
the nation
my
as a
wife.
whole and their subjects. This is why monarchs are typically not as aggressive and violent towards different ideas, and they may even work alongside different parties depending on what the monarch thinks is the best for the nation, and sometimes even act as a third party, trying to mediate in a constitutional crisis if a conflict between two or several parties grows out of hand. And remember what Juvenal stated, that even if a monarch is initially self-serving, he's gonna have to conform to the public majority for the sake of keeping his authority and maintaining stability? Well, populist dictators do not fall under this. If the entire party is loyal towards you, and you established a cult of personality where everyone knows you cannot do anything wrong, there is no real need to conform and be less self-serving. Anything you do, even if it is completely selfish and corrupt, will be seen as okay, depending on how strong your grip over the party and public is. Taking all of this into account, we can draw a simple conclusion. If power amplifies traits already present instead of being inherently corruptible, that means two people raised in entirely different ways and environments are gonna develop different traits and perspectives when it comes to power and responsibility. A monarch.
You can't change human nature, but you can definitely affect how human nature is being amplified when you're, changing how they're taught, the values, and all that type of stuff,
Raised with a strong sense of duty and responsibility, strict discipline, and care for their country and subjects is going to be much more responsible with wielding that power compared to a populist dictator who would develop all kinds of traits while growing up outside of traditional aristocratic circles, and especially while climbing the ranks to get to the top. Two entirely different people, raised in two different circles and two different methods, are gonna differ when their chance to shine eventually comes. Now, does this mean every monarch is gonna act responsibly?
No.
And is every populist
Because human
dictator
nature.
gonna be a bloodthirsty tyrant? Not necessarily. A populist dictator can sometimes even be better than a monarch, but
Yeah, but most of them are like, Francisco from Spain? He was trying to get close to God, and he cared for the country and loved it. He became a dictator, but he loved the country, right? That says more about him than, most of the parties that run. That's why I have some respect for Vox, actually. I give a lot of respect to Vox.
still, if one looks at history, it is a
Oh,
lot
by the way,
more
Lavader, make a video about Spain. Please, make a video about Spain. I want you to talk about Spain. Well, anything works. Spain's just a cool thing to talk about. It has a lot to do with what you're saying, bro. Talk about Spain,
likely
please.
and common
Please,
for a
bro.
monarch to be responsible with
For
their
me,
power
have a
and
list
not
now.
resort to drastic
For me.
measures like populist dictators to cement their power and legacy, for all the reasons I mentioned previously. I myself am not an absolute monarchist. I much more identify with Prussian constitutionalism, the system as seen in the German Empire. But when it comes down to it in the end, I will always prefer royal absolutism over any kind of populist or military dictatorship.
I love that video. That video was really good. I had a great time watching it, and I think it makes sense. Also, I love the title, The Royal Edge. But unfortunately, it was hard to really give commentary due to the lisp I have right now. I'm really sorry, guys. It's gonna be hard doing these videos. I'll adjust over time, though. Yeah, I hope we can see more soon in the future. Lavader, if you ever watch this video, I really, really, really want you to talk about Spain. I don't know if you already talked about Spain before. I gotta like check your videos out again. I haven't seen you in a while. You are a pretty awesome dude. I really do look up to you, bro. You do a lot of great things. And yeah, I'll see you later. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and subscribe to the channel and all that stuff. And yeah, Bennett out.